To understand how so many modern pseudoscientific beliefs took root, from flat Earth to creationism to lost civilization conspiracies, we have to start at the source, the ancient stories that shaped Western thinking, especially those found in the Bible. When the writers of Genesis spoke of creation, they weren't describing the universe as we know it today, because they didn't know it. They didn't know they lived on a planet orbiting a star. They didn't know about galaxies, the Big Bang, or billions of years of cosmic evolution. Their world was small, a flat land stretching out beneath their feet, covered by a solid dome, the firmament that held back the waters of the heavens. To them, the heavens and the earth meant just that, the ground they walked on, and the sky above, not a vast universe, but the visible stage of human life. And the stars? They weren't distant suns in a boundless galaxy. They were lights fixed in the dome, tiny holes or gateways to the eternal treasure house of light that lay beyond the sky. The stars were not worlds. They were windows, glimmers of the divine realm beyond the firmament. And when the flood story was told, it wasn't a tale of water covering a planet, because there was no planet in their minds. There was just the earth, meaning the ground, the land they knew. The flood covered their whole world, the only world they could see. Not a globe, not continents separated by vast oceans. Today, when people try to read that story as literal history, they imagine a global flood that would have reshaped the face of the earth. But the evidence for such an event simply doesn't exist, because the story was never meant to describe that kind of event. And in the Garden of Eden, we see the same pattern. God warns Adam and Eve that if they eat from the tree of knowledge, they will die. The serpent says they will not die, that their eyes will be opened and they will become like gods, knowing good and evil. And what happens? Their eyes are opened, they do not die. The serpent, not God, spoke the truth. But when we freeze that story into dogma, we lose its deeper meaning. We miss that it was never about literal history, but about human consciousness, about awakening, choice, and the loss of innocence. The tragedy is that these ancient stories, born from a small and beautiful human attempt to understand existence, were later hardened into dogma. They were mistaken for science and history. And when that happened, every new discovery that showed a bigger, older, stranger universe became a threat. People clung tighter to the old stories, and in the gaps between myth and fact, pseudoscience and conspiracy theories took root. To break free, we need to see these stories for what they are. Not failed science, but ancient poetry. Not literal history, but the first human attempts to grapple with meaning. And then we need to open our eyes to the real universe beyond them, a universe far more vast and wondrous than any treasure house of light imagined in the ancient sky. If we want to truly understand the ancient myths at the heart of Western thought, and see how they've been misunderstood, frozen, and turned into the soil where pseudoscience grows, we have to look at one of the most powerful figures of all, Moses. Moses was never meant to be just a historical character. He is the hero of a great inner journey, the seeker who rises from slavery, wanders through the wilderness of confusion, and leads his people toward a promised land. But that promised land was never meant to be a place you could find on a map. It was a symbol, a vision of a state of consciousness, a place of peace, unity, and oneness with the divine. The story of Moses isn't about finding a patch of earth flowing with milk and honey. It's about escaping bondage, not just physical bondage in Egypt, but the inner bondage of fear, ignorance, and separation. The wilderness Moses leads us through is the wilderness of the mind, the struggle of the soul to leave behind the old ways of thinking and to reach the higher ground of spiritual awakening. The Promised Land is not coordinates on a globe. It's a metaphor for that state of being where a person no longer feels cut off from the source of life, where the divisions fall away, where we realize that the divine is not out there somewhere, it's within us and within all things. But over time, as with so many of these ancient stories, the metaphor was mistaken for history. The Promised Land was turned into a political goal, a piece of territory. The journey of the soul was replaced by the conquest of land. And when that happened, the deeper wisdom of the myth was lost, and with it, the chance to understand what these stories were really offering. A map, not of the outer world, but of the inner world. When we mistake these inner maps for outer geography, confusion follows. And in that confusion, pseudoscientific ideas take root. People go looking for physical evidence of stories that were never about physical events. And when they can't find it, or when science shows a different picture, they either reject the science, or they build new conspiracies to explain it away. But the truth has been there all along. These stories were always pointing inward. The real promised land is the awakening of the human spirit. And when we see that clearly, we no longer need to defend myths as history. We can embrace them as the beautiful, powerful poetry they were meant to be, and turn our eyes, with wonder, to the real world they helped us begin to explore. To understand how literalism and pseudoscience took root, we have to see something most people don't realize. The Old Testament as we know it today, this collection of ancient stories, didn't exist in its final form in the cultures where these stories began. The ancient people who told these tales weren't reading them from a single book. They were part of a living oral tradition, a web of myths, laws, poems, and histories, told and retold, shaped and reshaped over centuries. These stories, of creation, of the flood, of Moses and the Promised Land, weren't originally meant to be read as one fixed, unified history. They were fragments of wisdom, woven together to teach moral, spiritual, and philosophical truths in ways that spoke to their time. But as centuries passed, and as cultures changed, those ancient myths began to lose their power to speak to the human heart. The old images, the old heroes, no longer reached people in the same way. So new storytellers, mystics, philosophers, spiritual reformers, shaped a new figure to carry the ancient wisdom in a new form. They created Jesus. Not as a single historical person who performed miracles and founded a religion, but as a symbolic character, a teaching tool, a personification of the path to spiritual awakening. In Jesus, the old myths were given new life. The Promised Land became the kingdom of heaven, not a place on earth, but a state of consciousness. The journey out of Egypt became the journey from illusion to truth. The serpent's gift of knowledge became Christ's call to inner transformation. But again, over time, the poetry was frozen into dogma. The symbolic Jesus was turned into a literal man-god whose life story had to be defended as historical fact. And when that happened, the deeper meaning was lost, and with it, the key to understanding the myths that had come before. People stopped seeing the stories as guides to inner awakening, and started defending them as outer history. And in doing so, they laid the foundation for generations of confusion, for pseudoscience, for conspiracy, for the endless war between myth and evidence. But here's the truth. These stories were always meant to point beyond themselves. Beyond the character of Moses, beyond the figure of Jesus, beyond the myths of creation and flood. They were maps of the inner world, teaching us how to wake up, how to see, how to live with compassion and wisdom. When we understand that, we can let go of the need to defend them as history, and finally see both myth and science clearly, side by side, each doing the work it was meant to do. To truly see how these ancient stories were meant to guide us, and how they were later misunderstood, we have to look at what they said about the greatest destinations of all: heaven and hell. To the ancients, heaven wasn't a distant city in the clouds where souls went after death. Heaven was the realm of eternal light, the light that lay beyond the stars, beyond the firmament, beyond the visible world. When they looked up at the night sky, they saw the stars as tiny windows, gateways through which that divine light shone down. Heaven was that great treasure house of light beyond the dome, the source, the origin, the ultimate truth. And hell? Hell wasn't some faraway pit of fire. Hell was here, the underworld, the world beneath the surface, the world of shadow and separation. To live in hell was to live in ignorance of the light, to live cut off from it, lost in darkness, confusion, and fear. But here's what's most important. The light of heaven wasn't just out there beyond the stars. The great teaching of the ancient mystics was that this light was also within us. The divine spark, the source of all being, lived in the human heart. The goal of the spiritual journey wasn't to get to some physical place after death. The goal was to find the light within while we live. Sin wasn't breaking rules. Sin meant missing the mark, failing to see or connect with that inner light. And repentance wasn't about punishment or guilt. It meant turning back toward the light. Salvation wasn't being rescued from an external hell. It was awakening to the truth that the light was always there, both beyond the stars and within ourselves. But over time, as these rich symbols hardened into dogma, heaven became a physical place in the sky, and hell a physical place of torment underground. Sin became rule-breaking. Salvation became about what happens after death. And in that shift, we lost the inner map these stories were offering. We traded the poetry of awakening for the fear of damnation. And in doing so, we laid the groundwork for literalist beliefs that reject evidence, cling to pseudoscience, and miss the true wonder these myths were meant to point us toward. But the ancient truth still shines through. The real journey is not to a place out there. It is to the light within. The same light that fills the universe beyond the stars. And this brings us to one of the most central figures in this story of misunderstood myth, Jesus. Just as Moses was shaped as a character to guide people toward inner awakening, so too was Jesus. The stories of Jesus and his 12 disciples weren't written to record the deeds of specific historical individuals. They were teaching tools, symbols. The 12 disciples represented different aspects of the inner journey. Different parts of ourselves we must awaken, challenge, or harmonize on the path to the light within. But as with so much of these ancient myths, the poetry was mistaken for history. The symbolic Jesus became a literal man-god. The 12 disciples, characters in a spiritual drama, were turned into literal followers, the founders of an earthly institution. And this is where confusion deepens. If one of those symbolic figures, let's say Peter, is named as the first pope, then what does that mean? It means that the entire foundation of the institution is built on a metaphor. If the first pope is a symbol, then the so-called second pope is actually the first literal pope. The institution claims to stand on the unbroken succession of authority, but what it stands on is a misunderstanding, the turning of teaching stories into claims of historical fact. This isn't said to attack the faith or its values. The problem isn't with the spiritual truths these stories point toward. The problem is what happens when we forget that they are stories, symbolic maps of the soul, and start defending them as literal history. When that happens, we not only lose the original wisdom, we create contradictions, confusions, and foundations that can't hold up under the weight of evidence. And from that confusion, pseudoscience grows. People start rejecting the findings of history, archaeology, and science, not because the evidence is weak, but because it threatens the literal story they've been taught to defend. But once we see the stories for what they are, guides to the inner light, we no longer need to defend their literal truth. We can embrace their real power and let go of the need to bend the facts of the world to fit a metaphor that was never meant as history.